Our listeners, get ready, because today we are diving deep into a debate that's had a really big impact on how we see ourselves, how we make decisions.
Absolutely.
Even how we structure society as a whole. It's the rationality wars.
Rationality wars, and thankfully you've given me a great guide for this journey.
Well, I'm excited to dive in.
An article by Gerd Gigerenzer, who is a major player in this whole intellectual battle.
Now, you might be thinking rationality wars sounds a bit much.
A little intense.
But trust me, this stuff gets real. Especially for learners like you who want to understand how we make choices in a world that is overflowing with information.
And uncertainty.
Uncertainty, exactly.
It all begins in the 1960s with the backdrop of the Cold War.
So we've got like nuclear annihilation on the horizon.
The threat of nuclear war is very real and present.
Everyone's kind of freaking out a bit.
This really shaped how people thought about making decisions.
Yeah, like what is the right decision?
The right decisions, the best decisions.
When it comes to that.
And what emerged was this idea of Cold War rationality.
It's Cold War rationality.
Which was this idea that if we could just strip away all the emotions and rely on pure logic, we could avoid making disastrous choices.
Things like game theory, calculating risks.
Exactly, maximizing expected utility.
So almost like an equation for avoiding the apocalypse.
Yeah, it was a very mechanistic view of human behavior.
So almost like picturing humans as perfectly rational machines.
Yeah, calculating every move. And this way of thinking, it wasn't just confined to military strategy either. It became a bedrock of economics, and it influenced a lot of different social sciences.
Makes sense.
But then, just like any good story, there's a twist.
Okay.
In the 1970s, a couple of psychologists, Tversky and Kahneman, they started noticing some cracks in this seemingly perfect fortress of rationality.
Okay, so they're not saying logic is bad.
No, not at all. They were pointing out that humans, well, we have these things called cognitive biases that sometimes throw a wrench in our perfectly logical thinking.
So give us an example of that.
Well, think about the conjunction fallacy. It's this weird quirk where people think that a combination of events is more likely than a single event.
Okay.
Even when that makes absolutely no logical sense.
So, for example, if you assumed it's more likely that someone's both a banker and a marathon runner.
Precisely.
Okay.
Because you think, oh, there are not that many marathon runners, so if they're a banker and a marathon runner, that's even...
You narrow the field even more. But that's not how probability works.
Not how it works.
Okay.
And there are tons of other biases too, like the availability bias, where we overestimate the likelihood of things that easily come to mind.
Right.
Things we see on the news a lot.
Yeah, the more we hear about something, the more likely we think it is, even if it's statistically super rare.
Even if it's incredibly rare statistically.
Yeah.
And these findings, they really started shaking things up.
Right, because they were suggesting that human decision-making is not as purely rational as we might have thought. And this is where our guide for this deep dive, Gerd Gigerenzer, enters the scene. He brought a whole new perspective to the table.
Great. He was inspired by this concept called bounded rationality. Basically says our brains have limits.
Makes sense.
We can't be constantly crunching numbers and weighing every possibility.
Right, we're not supercomputers. So it's like we are rational, but
within the bounds of what our brains can handle.
Within the bounds, exactly.
And from there, he developed this idea of ecological rationality. He argued that reason isn't just about internal logic. It's about how our minds work in the messy, complex, real world.
So less about following abstract rules and more about how we actually function.
Yes, how our thinking actually functions in the environments that we live in. And this is where the rationality wars really start to heat up. And Gigerenzer's article really lays out these several key battlefronts in this debate.
Okay.
Each one highlighting a fundamental question about how we think and make decisions.
Ooh, I like this.
But before we jump into those battlefronts,
okay,
let's just make sure that we're all on the same page about what heuristics are, because I have a feeling we're going to be hearing that word a lot.
Yeah, I was going to say, what is that?
So a heuristic is basically a mental shortcut. It's a rule of thumb that helps us make decisions quickly.
It's like a mental shortcut that kind of bypasses a more complex calculation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're not always perfectly accurate, but they're often good enough, especially when we have to make decisions under pressure or with limited information. So it's not about being perfectly logical. It's about using these mental shortcuts to navigate the world more efficiently. And Gigerenzer actually argues that these heuristics, while they sometimes lead to those biases that we talked about, they're actually signs of our mind's incredible ability to adapt and make smart decisions in a complex world.
This is already blowing my mind a little bit.
Just wait.
Okay.
It gets even better.
All right.
Because Gigerenzer doesn't just critique the traditional view of rationality, he offers a really compelling alternative.
So we've established our brains aren't these perfect logic machines. We've got heuristics, these mental shortcuts that we use to navigate the world. But where does that leave us in these rationality wars? Does Gigerenzer just think we should throw logic out the window?
No, not at all. He acknowledges that logic is important.
Okay.
But he says that we need to take uncertainty seriously. Traditional models of rationality often assume that we can calculate these probabilities for everything, which in the real world...
Yeah, the real world is a messy place. There's all these unforeseen events, unexpected outcomes, stuff we just couldn't have predicted.
It's like trying to use a super detailed map to navigate a city where, buildings are constantly popping up and streets are changing direction all the time.
So how does Gigerenzer think we should be making decisions then?
Well, he argues that our minds have evolved to deal with this uncertainty. We don't need to know all the probabilities to make good choices.
Okay.
We can use simple heuristics, those rules of thumb, that are tailored to specific environments.
So it's about having the right tool for the job, even if that tool isn't always perfectly precise.
Exactly.
Wow.
And this is where Gigerenzer's work gets really fascinating. He's not just saying that heuristics are good enough. He's arguing that they can actually be incredibly intelligent tools. In a world full of uncertainty, trying to calculate every single possibility, it would be exhausting and probably impossible. So heuristics allow us to make quick, efficient decisions that are often surprisingly accurate.
Can you give me a concrete example of this?
Sure.
Because I'm having a little bit of trouble wrapping my head around how, a shortcut can be more intelligent than, a detailed calculation.
So one of Gigerenzer's most famous examples is this thing called the take the best heuristic.
The take the best heuristic.
It's incredibly simple. So imagine you're trying to decide between two options, like which restaurant to go to. So you're hungry. You need to pick a restaurant. So with the take the best heuristic, you just start by looking at cues one by one in order of their importance to you.
Okay.
So maybe the first cue is online reviews, and one restaurant has way better reviews than the other one. Boom, decision made.
Easy peasy.
You don't need to consider other factors like price or distance.
So simple. I love it.
Right.
What if the reviews are similar, though?
Then you just move on to the next cue. Maybe it's price, maybe it's cuisine type. The key is you stop as soon as you find a cue that clearly distinguishes between the two options.
Less is more in this case.
Exactly. And here's the kicker. Gigerenzer's research has shown that in certain situations, the take the best heuristic can actually lead to better predictions than complex models that try to factor in all of the available information.
That's counterintuitive.
Yeah. It is counterintuitive, but it makes sense when you consider the fact that the real world is full of noise and irrelevant information, and trying to factor in everything can actually lead you astray. Sometimes a simple, focused approach is better.
This is completely changing how I think about decision making. So I'm starting to see how these heuristics, even if they sometimes lead to biases, can be really powerful tools. But it makes me wonder if we can learn to use these mental shortcuts more effectively. Do we even need things like nudges?
That's a great question.
From governments and organizations?
It gets to the heart of this big debate about paternalism. If we are so prone to making irrational decisions, should those in power be nudging us towards the right choices?
It does feel a bit like we're being treated like children sometimes, like we can't be trusted.
Exactly. And Gigerenzer is very skeptical of this approach. He points out that there's often a lack of evidence that people actually suffer negative consequences because of their supposedly irrational choices.
So maybe we're not as bad at decision-making as some people think.
Maybe not. And Gigerenzer argues that instead of nudging people, we should be focusing on education. He's had great success teaching doctors how to understand complex medical statistics using simple, intuitive methods.
So empowering people with knowledge and skills instead of trying to manipulate their behavior.
Exactly. It's about fostering a culture of critical thinking and judgment rather than relying on external authorities to tell us what to do.
This is so interesting, and it's making me think, what about those people who really fiercely defend that heuristics and biases approach? Like, how do they respond to these critiques?
Well, the debate is far from settled. Some argue that Gigerenzer is downplaying the significance of cognitive biases and overstating the effectiveness of simple heuristic. They point out that there are many situations where our biases can lead to serious errors in judgment.
So they're saying we shouldn't be too quick to dismiss the power of logic and deliberate reasoning. So it's not as simple as like logic is bad, heuristics are good, or the other way around. There's a gray area.
There's a lot of gray area. Both sides of the debate have valid points. It seems like the key is finding a balance between acknowledging the limitations of our minds and recognizing our remarkable ability to adapt and make decisions in these complex environments.
Which brings us back to this idea of ecological rationality. It's about how our minds work in specific contexts, not just measuring them against some kind of standard.
Right. It's about appreciating the diversity of human reasoning and recognizing that what counts as rational can vary depending on the situation.
It's really challenged how I think about this whole idea of rationality. What does being rational actually mean for us? And Gigerenzer in this article, he pushes us to think about it in a slightly different way. He says that rationality isn't just about this cold, hard logic. It's about judgment. It's about experience and knowing which tools to use in which situations. So less about following like a rigid set of rules and more about adapting our thinking to the demands of the real world.
Yeah, absolutely. He's urging us to move beyond this idea that there's a single universal form of reason that applies to every situation.
So what works for like a physicist solving equations might not work for an artist creating a painting.
Precisely. And that's okay. It means we need to expand our understanding of what it means to be rational.
It's not just logic. It's intuition, creativity, emotional intelligence even.
Absolutely. All of those things.
This is making me think about all those times that I've like beat myself up for not being perfectly logical.
Yeah, it's a common trap. We judge ourselves so harshly with not making decisions like some kind of idealized rational actor. But maybe that's the wrong standard to apply, especially when you consider the fact that experts in fields like economics and psychology, they're still debating what rationality actually means.
Right. So maybe our gut feelings and intuitions are more valuable than we give them credit for.
Especially when we're dealing with so much uncertainty and complexity, sometimes a purely logical approach just isn't feasible.
Right. Think about like a doctor making a diagnosis.
They have to consider all sorts of factors.
Test results, the patient's history, even subtle cues.
The body language.
It's like they're piecing together a puzzle using logic but also intuition to get to the best solution.
And Gigerenzer would argue that this kind of ecological rationality is what makes us so adaptable as humans.
How can we become more ecologically rational in our own lives?
Well, I think one of the key takeaways is to just become more aware of our own mental processes. Like, what heuristics do we rely on?
Yeah, when do they work? Well, when do they lead us astray?
Exactly. It's about developing a kind of metacognitive awareness where we can step back and observe our own thinking in action.
So like, become a scientist of our own minds.
Yes.
Observing, experimenting, refining our mental strategies.
And Gigerenzer is a huge advocate for education, not just about specific heuristics, but about these broader principles of ecological rationality. He believes we can learn to make better decisions by understanding the strengths and weaknesses of different approaches.
It's about giving people the tools to think critically and to make more informed choices.
Exactly. And this goes beyond individual decision-making as well. It has implications for how we design policies, how we educate our children, how we interact with each other as a society.
Wow, this has really opened my eyes to a whole new way of thinking about rationality. It's so much more than just, logic and calculation.
That's the beauty of these kinds of explorations, isn't it?
Yeah.
They challenge our assumptions, they broaden our perspectives, and often leave us with more questions than answers.
But that's a good thing. It means we're engaging with ideas that matter, ideas that have the potential to change how we see ourselves in the world.
Absolutely. So to our listeners out there, I encourage you to keep exploring these ideas. Check out Gigerenzer's work, dive into those opposing views and the rationality wars, and most importantly, reflect on your own experiences.
Yeah.
What mental strategies help you navigate the complexities of life? What makes you feel like you're making good decisions, even when those decisions might not fit neatly into that textbook definition of rationality?
That's such a good point. This deep dive wasn't about giving you all the answers.
No.
It was about sparking that curiosity, making you think differently about how you think, and encouraging you to explore this really fascinating world of human decision-making.
It is a fascinating world, and even if we're not always perfectly logical, our ability to navigate a world full of uncertainty and complexity is truly remarkable.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the rationality wars. Keep those minds curious, learners, and we'll catch you on our next adventure.